I arrived outside my office building that Wednesday morning carrying a medium paper cup of coffee that was still too hot to drink comfortably, standing beneath a tall glass facade that reflected a dull gray sky and the slow movement of traffic behind me, because I had deliberately come in 10 minutes early with the intention of giving myself a quiet buffer before the noise of the workday swallowed me whole. The building itself was already waking up in its usual mechanical rhythm, with badge readers beeping as employees entered through the side doors, delivery trucks idling near the loading bay, and a few familiar co-workers scattered along the sidewalk, each lost in their own version of the same ritualistic pause that happens before people mentally surrender to another long day of deadlines and meetings. I positioned myself near the side entrance, close enough that I could swipe in whenever I chose, yet far enough that I wasn't obstructing foot traffic, leaning slightly against the concrete wall while scrolling through overnight emails, my company badge hanging clearly from my belt, swinging gently every time I shifted my weight or adjusted my grip on the coffee cup. As I stood there absorbing the caffeine and mentally rehearsing the morning agenda, I became aware of a strange pressure, the subtle but unmistakable sensation of being watched, which made me lift my eyes from my phone and scan the area until I noticed a woman standing near the edge of the parking lot, motionless, arms crossed tightly against her chest, sunglasses planted firmly on her face despite the absence of sunlight. She was positioned just far enough away to make her attention feel deliberate rather than accidental, and when our eyes met, she didn't look away, didn't pretend to check her phone or watch the traffic, but instead continued to stare with an intensity that immediately made my shoulders tense and my instincts shift from relaxed to alert. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence and returned my attention to my phone, telling myself that people stare for all kinds of harmless reasons. Yet when I glanced up again a full minute later, her posture and gaze remained unchanged, as though she had been standing there cataloging my presence with a level of scrutiny that felt disproportionate to the situation. At that point, the calm I had hoped to enjoy dissolved into unease, and I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, the sound of cars passing, the murmur of distant conversations, and the way my coffee cup felt suddenly conspicuous in my hand, as if it were evidence in a case I didn't know I was involved in. She began walking toward me with slow, measured steps, closing the distance deliberately while maintaining that same rigid posture. And when she stopped several feet away, far enough to avoid violating personal space yet close enough to assert authority, she tilted her head slightly and addressed me with a tone that assumed wrongdoing before I had even opened my mouth. "Can I help you?" she asked, not as a genuine question but as a challenge, as though my mere presence required justification. I looked at her, surprised but careful to keep my expression neutral, and replied that I worked in the building and was simply having my coffee before going inside, lightly gesturing toward my visible badge as proof of something I shouldn't have needed to prove at all. Her eyes moved quickly between my face, my badge, and the building behind me, yet instead of relaxing, her expression hardened, as if the information I provided conflicted with the conclusion she had already reached internally and was unwilling to abandon. "Well, it looks strange," she said, her voice carrying irritation rather than relief, while vaguely motioning toward the building as if the space itself belonged to her authority. "People don't just stand around outside places like this." I glanced around instinctively, noticing other employees doing exactly that, leaning against railings, pacing slowly while talking on phones, or sipping drinks while waiting for colleagues, and the realization that I had been singled out made the interaction feel less about behavior and more about perception. Before I could respond further, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, turning slightly away from me in a manner that suggested finality rather than deliberation. And within seconds, I heard her voice change into something calm and composed as she began speaking to someone on the other end of the line. "Yes, hello," she said clearly enough for me to hear. "I'd like to report a suspicious man loitering outside an office building." The words landed heavily, transforming the quiet morning into something charged and dangerous. And as she continued speaking, calmly describing my appearance, my location, and the fact that I had been standing there for a while, I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. As I realized she was calling 911, I stood there listening to my own presence being reframed as a threat, aware that every movement now carried risk, and while part of me wanted to object or defend myself, another part understood that escalation, even verbal, could only make the situation worse once law enforcement was involved. When she ended the call and turned back toward me, she wore a tight smile that suggested moral victory, as she told me that if I truly belonged there, I had nothing to worry about. A statement that ignored the reality that police encounters are never neutral experiences when someone else controls the narrative. The patrol car arrived within minutes, rolling quietly to the curb as two officers stepped out and surveyed the scene, and immediately the woman waved them down with visible urgency, pointing toward me as if she were presenting evidence she had been waiting to reveal. I remained exactly where I was, coffee cup still in hand, shoulders relaxed, but posture intentional, because I knew that appearing calm and compliant mattered more in that moment than expressing how absurd or unfair the situation felt. One of the officers approached me and asked what I was doing there. His tone professional, but cautious, and I explained that I worked in the building, had arrived early, and was simply standing outside with my coffee before heading in. I pointed to my badge, provided my name, and even offered to swipe into the building for confirmation, while explaining that many employees stood outside in the mornings for the same reason. And as I spoke, I could see the tension in the officer's posture begin to ease. They asked how long I had been standing there, and when I answered honestly that it had been only a few minutes, they exchanged a glance that suggested the situation was already clear to them. Turning to the woman, they listened patiently as she repeated her concerns, emphasizing her discomfort and the fact that she didn't recognize me, as though unfamiliarity alone justified emergency intervention. One officer calmly explained that standing outside a workplace with visible identification was not suspicious behavior, that no laws had been broken, and that calling 911 for such a situation was unnecessary, a statement that visibly unsettled her as the authorities she expected failed to materialize. "So he's just allowed to stand there?" she asked, incredulous. "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied evenly. "He is." They apologized to me for the inconvenience, returned to their vehicle, and drove away, leaving behind an awkward silence and a woman who suddenly had nowhere to direct her certainty. I finished my coffee slowly, walked inside the building, swiped my badge, and took my place among the steady flow of employees entering the lobby. Yet the normalcy of the space felt altered, as though something invisible had shifted. The rest of the day unfolded as usual, filled with meetings and emails. But the incident lingered in my thoughts, replaying itself during quiet moments as I reflected on how easily a routine morning could be transformed into a police encounter simply because someone decided I didn't belong. Since then, I still stand outside sometimes with my coffee, but I do so with a new awareness of how presence is interpreted, how stillness can be misread, and how quickly suspicion can be manufactured when someone chooses fear over understanding. All because I once stood outside my own office building doing nothing more than preparing myself for another ordinary day.